Hello, I'm Elaine Montgomery, and today it is my pleasure to tell you a story that was very exceptional for me, and it's my pleasure to tell you again the story that took place in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. Why Botswana, you might ask? Well, since I was a very young child, I loved to read adventure stories, and as I read them, I think someday I'm going to visit those exotic places. Several years ago now, I met an author whose name was Alexander McCall Smith. He was from Zimbabwe, and he was writing stories about a woman's detective agency in Botswana, of all places. His protagonist was a very clever woman detective. What a great place to visit, I thought, as he described what it was like to be living in such an exotic other world where people treated each other actually very well. About 5 years ago, I was invited to join a tent safari in Botswana. I jumped at the chance, of course, and gathered up all my stuff and off I went. For those of you who, most of you will know about tent safaris, but for those who haven't been there, we live in the tents, usually for 1 or 2 weeks, about 14 people. We sleep obviously under canvas, and we eat in the outdoors under a tarpaulin, and each day the 14 of us jump into a truck and are driven into exotic places in the desert, in the delta, by our driver, who is also our guide. And these guides are extremely good at finding the animals or the birds. And also they love to drive through bushes, through tall grasses, through streams, and give us a good scare because we never know how deep the streams are. And generally, they are our guides. We didn't see very many other of the tourists in other trucks, although we did know that the drivers all kept in touch with each other and told each other when there was something to be seen. This was very special because that way we, in the morning, very often knew exactly where we were going. We had a wonderful time, and it wasn't long before I realized that elephants were my absolutely favorite animal, the favorite thing I like to watch. We would often see them traveling in herds, and each day we would usually go to the watering hole, which is where all the herds came, obviously for a drink of water and maybe to visit with each other. Because what we discovered was that elephants travel in matriarchal herds. And this means that in each herd, the eldest senior elephant, and usually the biggest, is the matriarch, and what she says is what the rest of the group will do. She takes them wherever she wants to, and they come with no question, and she's in charge of looking after what is going to happen that day, and presumably that night and the rest of the year. The other thing that was my favorite was that these herds looked after their babies quite nicely, and it was often the teenage girls that were the babysitters. One thing that I found was just a delight to watch was at the watering holes, watching the tiny babies. And we discovered that we were told that if the babies would fit under the mother's belly, they were probably less than a month old. And we did see quite a few of them that were that tiny. Anyway, at the watering holes, all the elephants would get there, they'd go in, they'd suck up some water in their trunk and squirt it into their mouths. But the babies could not decide what this thing was flopping around on the front of their face. What was it for? How were they supposed to use it? And it was always kind of floppy, just like a rope that you're taking and you're whirling it around. They would put it in the water, they'd fiddle around, they'd try to decide what they were supposed to do, but sucking up the water and putting it in their mouth was not happening very quickly. Eventually, the babies would usually just go down onto their knees, put their mouth in the water, and have their very own drink. The other thing that happened with the elephants was that the bigger elephants always looked after the younger elephants if there was any sign of danger at all. And so we noticed that when anything was happening that they weren't sure about, the big elephants would gather the younger ones, and the babies and the teenagers would be in the middle of the group, and the bigger elephants would be around the outside. They would stay in this like this until any thought of danger was past or until it was time to move on. And one day, an interesting thing that happened was we were stopped at the side of the road. A herd of elephants was coming towards us, and all of a sudden, the bigger elephants were down the middle of the road, and at the outside, away from our truck, was the smaller ones and the babies. And the big elephants took a good look into the truck, and I almost expected them to ask if we had our passports handy, because they looked very menacing and we really could see not much but their eyes and maybe part of their ears. So this was my experience with the elephants, and it was very special, until one morning we had a report that there was possibly a dead elephant somewhere close. We went looking, and it wasn't long until we saw that, yes, there was an elephant lying at the side of the road about 30 meters from the track. And its feet were facing towards the road, but it was just lying there, not moving. There was no sign of blood, but there was about a 3-meter hole in the stomach. We also, though, noticed that, again, on the same side of the road, and not far from this elephant, was a whole herd. And there were big ones and small ones and even very tiny babies in the herd. The next thing we noticed as we parked the truck and sat very quiet was we were under a tree for the shade. There was also a whole pride of lions that was lying in the shade under the tree. Some of them were sleeping, some of them were sitting on their haunches, and all of us were looking towards this very still elephant. We sat and waited and wondered what was going to happen next. So a few minutes later, the largest animal detached herself from the herd, and this was probably the matriarch. She walked slowly over to the still elephant, looked at it, touched it with her trunk, stood for a few minutes, and then walked around this still elephant and walked to the side of the elephant that was away from the herd, turned around so that she could look and see the still elephant and also the herd. A few minutes later, another elephant, another of the large elephants, did the same thing. Walked slowly from the herd, came towards the elephant, touched it with her trunk, stood for a moment, and then she joined the matriarch. But as she reached the matriarch, she touched the matriarch also with her trunk. Then she turned around so that both of them were standing side by side, each looking at the fallen elephant and looking towards the herd. This continued until the large elephants had all said their farewells to their dead companion. But the next thing that happened was that the teenagers, whose turn it was to say goodbye, each brought a baby with them. So there was a teenager and a tiny elephant, and they came slowly together. Each of them touched the elephant, and then they walked over. Each of them greeted the matriarch by touching her and joined the herd. This continued until all of the elephants had said their farewells. Meanwhile, we sat in the truck and watched, and the lions did exactly the same thing. There was no noise from the elephants, the lions, or the humans. It was a very moving experience. We knew that the elephants took good care of their children, but little did we know that they said farewell to their companions. This was nature at its most profound and spiritual. And we were blessed to be a small part of their ceremony. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you.